He was expelled from 3 universities: linguistics, engineering, history. All his life, people have told him he lacks focus, that he never finishes anything. And then a foreign god tells him that this is exactly why he will save the whole world. But Dan Carver hasn't gotten that far yet. First, he opens his eyes in the wet grass and doesn't know where he is. A second ago, he was dozing on a night bus under the flickering of the suburban streetlights. Now the rain is lashing his face. Cold. Vicious. It makes your fingers go numb and your lips lose all feeling. No road, no bus, no sound except the downpour. Dan jumps to his feet and realizes the world he knew ended without warning. No flash, no portal. Just one page of his life snapped shut, and the next was written in a language he doesn't know. Not yet, anyway. He runs. Not because he knows where, but because in a downpour like this, you'll freeze to death in 20 minutes. Ahead, on the hill, a silhouette looms darkly. Columns. A gaping entrance, the ruins of a temple or a palace or something else for which he has no words yet. Dan stumbles inside. The ceiling is full of holes. Water is pouring in from 3 places. But in the middle, a dry patch around a stone platform, and on the platform lies a book. And this is where the strangeness begins. Rain is lashing through the holes, water is running down the columns, but the book is dry, completely, as if the water lacks the audacity to touch the cover. Dan approaches. He always approached what he shouldn't have, always opened what shouldn't be opened. That was his main problem in his former life. He opens the book. The pages are covered with symbols found in no language in the world. Not Latin, not hieroglyphs, not Arabic script. Something else that makes his fingertips tingle as he traces the lines. And the letters form a voice. Not a sound, not a whisper from outside. The voice sounds right inside his skull. Tired, warm, very human. The voice says, finally. That he's been waiting. That he doesn't need a mage or a warrior or a king. He needs someone who can not just read, but understand. And that he's been waiting for just such a fool. Dan slams the book shut. The voice doesn't fade away. It continues speaking calmly, with a hint of mockery, like a teacher who has waited for his one and only student and has no intention of letting him go. The voice explains. This world is called Al-Dorain. Once upon a time, the gods lived here among humans and shared their knowledge as freely as the air. And then the silence of the heavens struck. The gods left, or perished, or were devoured by someone. Knowledge scattered. Formulas lost half their symbols. People were left with scraps of instructions from a world that no longer works as it should. The voice says that he is one of those gods, or rather, what remains of him, the god of knowledge. He doesn't give a name. He says he hid it separately, long ago. But he has placed his final will in this book, and in the one who opens it. Dan asks aloud, why him? The voice answers simply, because 3 universities, because linguistics and engineering and history. Any normal specialist knows one thing and digs deep, but a god needs a vessel that knows a little of everything. Broad, not filled to the brim anywhere, the perfect form to hold everything. Dan's bad luck turns out to be his only salvation. The voice falls silent. The book crumbles, literally. The cover turns to dust. The pages vanish as if they were never there. But inside Dan's head, something changes. He looks down at the wet stones and suddenly sees them, for real. He sees the structure of the masonry. He understands what kind of mortar was used to lay it. He realizes that the left column cracked not from age, but from a mistake in the foundation. He sees it as clearly as an open book. The world unfolds before him like a blueprint. Dan stays in the ruins until morning. The rain lets up before dawn. He goes outside and finds a path. The path runs down the hill through the forest, towards something resembling a country road. He walks. By day, he comes out near a village. A dozen houses, stone walls, tile roofs flecked with crystals. People eye him suspiciously, ragged, wet, without belongings or papers. But he already understands the language. The voice in the ruins wasn't lying. The local dialect seeped into him as he walked through the forest. Snippets of conversation from the fields, children's shouts, a coachman's curses. By the time he reaches the center of the village, he's already speaking, with an accent, with pauses, but he speaks. The village elder comes out himself, an elderly man with a weary face and hands that know hard work. He asks who Dan is and where he's from. Dan replies that he's a traveler, that he's lost his way, that he's willing to work for food. The elder looks at him for a long time. Then he nods. There's work. But first he leads him to the square. There stands a pillar. At the top of the pole sits a crystal the size of a human head. It used to shine. Now it barely glows. A pale, murky light inside, like a candle about to go out. The village head explains. This is the eternal lantern, an artifact from a bygone era. It warmed homes in the winter. It lit the streets at night. Without it, the village won't survive the cold. 3 mages have come over the past year. The first shook his head and left. The second tried to repair it and nearly shattered the crystal. The third called the formula incomplete and said that without the lost knowledge, repair was impossible. Dan approaches the pillar. He doesn't know why. He's drawn to it. That new thing that's taken root in his mind is drawn to the crystal like a magnet to iron. He looks at the dull stone, and he sees, not with his eyes, with something else that used to slumber but has now awakened and is eagerly taking in the world. He sees the crystal's structure, the runic network inside, 6 layers of formulas intertwined like the roots of a tree, and 3 empty spaces, 3 holes in the pattern, 3 runes that someone tore out or that time has erased. The mages failed because they inserted standard runes, the correct ones, by the book. But this crystal is cracked, its network has warped over the centuries. Standard runes won't fit. Different ones are needed, the wrong ones. The ones that fit this specific crystal with its cracks and its history. Dan asks for a coal. The elder gives it to him. Dan drops to his knees right into the wet ground of the square and draws 3 runes at the base of the pillar. They look nothing like anything in the local textbooks. Crooked, asymmetrical. Like a patch that is sewn not to a pattern but to the shape of the hole. The crystal flares up. It doesn't just light up. It flares up so brightly that the people in the square squint. A warm, golden light floods the village. So bright that the lantern hasn't burned like this in the last 100 years. The village elder says it's even brighter than in his childhood. The village elder is crying, unashamedly, right in front of everyone. He stands there and cries, gazing at the light. Because this light means the children won't freeze in winter, that the elderly will live to see spring, that the village will hold on a little longer. One of the women calls Dan a master. Another utters a word he's hearing for the first time in his life. Genius. They call him a genius. Dan Carver. The man who dropped out of 3 universities. The man who's been told his whole life that he lacks focus. He stands in the middle of a strange village in a strange world with a piece of coal in his hand and feels something crack inside. It doesn't break. It opens up. Like a door that was always locked and that he stopped to jiggle. The village elder feeds him, gives him dry clothes, assigns him a room at a widow's house on the edge of the village. In the evening, Dan sits by the window and looks at the golden light of the lantern. His mind is quiet. The voice from the book is silent, but the knowledge remains. He looks at the wall and sees that the 3rd brick from the left is laid at an angle and will crack in 2 years. He looks at the window frame and realizes that the builder was left-handed and in a hurry. The world lies before him like an open book, and for the first time in his life, Dan knows how to read it. In the morning, he leaves, not because he's being chased away, but because the voice, before falling silent, left him with one thing. The lighthouses are going out. The village lantern was a trifle, but somewhere in the big cities stand the lighthouses of understanding. Giant crystals in which the world's last systematized knowledge is stored. And they are going out, one by one. The village elder gives him food for the road and tells him that the nearest big city is Wayland. The great academy stands there. There is a lighthouse there, and there, a man who repairs the irreparable might come in handy. Dan heads west, along a dirt road, with a knapsack on his back, with a head full of others' knowledge and the warm light of a foreign world behind him. The journey to Wayland took 4 days. Dan walked, and the world opened up to him with every step. He read the ground beneath his feet like a book. Clay soil meant a river was nearby. Wheel tracks meant a trade route was close. A fragment of a stone signpost on the roadside bore half-erased runes, and Dan read them in a second. 60 leagues to Wayland. The signpost was 300 years old. The runes on it belonged to the era before the silence. No one in this world could read them anymore. But to Dan, they were like a sign at a bus stop. He walked and learned, not from books, from the world. Every plant he encountered was broken down in his mind into its structure. This shrub is poisonous because its sap contains a substance that destroys certain cells. This berry is edible because its chemical composition is safe. He wasn't a botanist, he just saw how things worked. On the second day, he caught up with a trade caravan. 3 wagons, 10 guards. A merchant named Bourne was heading to Wayland with a cargo of cloth and spices. Dan asked to join them. Bourne looked at him skeptically, a penniless, ragged fellow. But Dan noticed that the axle of the rear wagon was about to snap. He pointed out to Bourne the spot where the wood had begun to split. He explained that in half a day's travel on this road, the axle would break and the wagon would come to a halt. Bourne checked it. His face darkened. He ordered it repaired. Dan asked for tools, and within an hour reinforced the axle so that it would last another 3 months. Not because he was a carpenter, but because he saw where the wood was weak and where it needed support. Bourne seated him in the front wagon and fed him all the way to the city. Along the way, Dan listened. Bourne loved to talk. Dan learned that Wayland was an academic city. Half the population was connected in one way or another to the great academy. Scholars, students, artisans serving the scientists, merchants selling materials for experiments, and mages, lots of mages. Bourne said that magic in this world is a fickle thing. The formulas are incomplete. Spells work only half the time. Every mage is essentially a researcher trying to piece together a mosaic from the fragments. Those who succeed better than others become professors at the academy. Those who don't succeed become mercenaries or join the army, where they're required to use brute force rather than understanding. Bourne also mentioned the beacons. He said that the Wayland beacon is still burning, but dimmer than before, and that people are nervous. Because if the beacon goes out, the academy will lose access to the systematized knowledge stored within it, and without it, half of all research will grind to a halt. Dan asked how many beacons there were in total. Bourne said there used to be 12. Now 5 are burning. The rest have gone out over the last 30 years. No one knows why. Scientists say it's a natural process. Priests say the gods are taking back what is theirs. Kings say it doesn't matter why, but who controls the remaining ones does. On the 4th day, Dan saw Wayland. The city stood in a valley between 2 mountain ranges, stone walls, towers. The spires of the academy towered above everything else, and above the spires the lighthouse hovered. A huge crystal the size of a house, hanging in the air with no visible support. It glowed. A pale blue, flickering light. Beautiful. But Dan saw what others did not. The light was uneven. It pulsed, like the heartbeat of a sick person. Too slow, intermittent. The lighthouse was fading. Slowly, but fading. Dan entered the city through the eastern gate. The guards asked no questions. Bourne had said that Wayland was used to vagabonds. The academy drew people from all over the world. The gifted, the desperate, the mad. One more ragged soul, one less. The market was the first thing he saw. A huge square crammed with stalls, food, fabrics, tools, and a separate row that immediately caught his attention. Artifacts. Dozens of stalls with broken magical items, crystals, amulets, devices whose purpose he understood at a glance, even though he'd never seen anything like them before. A heating element based on a fire rune, broken. The circuit is open in the 3rd layer. Fixing it will take 2 minutes and a single stroke of charcoal. A levitating lamp. Doesn't work. The anchor rune is engraved incorrectly. It needs to be erased and recarve it. A rune-based water filter. Clogged. But not with dirt, rather with a parasitic rune that had grown on its own like mold. Remove it and the filter will work again. Dan saw all this and his fingers itched. He had no money, no food for tomorrow, no roof over his head. but he had his hands and his know-how. He approached the street vendor who was selling broken artifacts, an elderly man with a sour expression. Dan said he could fix 3 items from his stock. If he fixed them, the vendor would pay him. If he didn't, Dan walk away owing nothing. The vendor looked at him like he was an idiot. Then he shrugged. He pulled out a heating element and said that if this ragamuffin could fix it, he'd get 2 copper wedges. Dan took the coal. He traced a single line along the crack in the runic circuit. The element hummed and heated up. The stall owner dropped it in surprise. Then he picked it up. Then he looked at Dan with new eyes. Dan fixed 2 more artifacts, a lamp and a filter. Each took less than a minute. The stallkeeper paid him and told his neighbors. By evening, Dan was sitting on an upside-down crate in the middle of the market, and there was a line of people waiting for him. People brought him broken things. He fixed them. Not everything. Some artifacts were beyond repair, and he was honest about that. But whatever could be fixed, he fixed. Quickly, precisely, with a single stroke in the right place. By sunset, he had enough coins for a room and dinner, and people were watching him. He could feel it. Not just the market onlookers, someone from the city's upper terraces, someone from the windows of the academy. He knew he had attracted attention. The question was, what kind of attention? The answer came the next morning. Dan had just started working at the market when 2 people approached him, a man and a woman. The man was dressed in an academy robe, dark blue with silver embroidery, an administrative rank, not a scholar, a bureaucrat. The woman. Dan looked at her and his system flared up as it hadn't since he'd awakened. Young, his age or slightly younger, black hair pulled back into a tight knot, eyes dark and cold as a winter lake. An academy professor's robe, white with a gold trim. There were runes on it, not decorative, functional, protective patterns woven into the fabric. And Dan saw every single one of them, saw how they were connected, saw that 3 of them contained errors that the owner had discovered and compensated for with other runes. It was the work of a genius, clumsy, with patches, but brilliant. The official said that by order of the dean's office, Dan was being invited to the academy for an exam to determine his qualifications. Dan understood from the tone that this was not an invitation, but a summons. The woman was silent. She stared at Dan without blinking, studying him, just as he studied artifacts. Only she was studying him. Dan asked her name. She replied that it didn't matter, and that he'd better not be late. She turned and left. The official sighed and said that this was Professor Sora Han, the youngest full professor in the Academy's history, Department of Runic Structure, and that Dan really had better not be late. Dan watched her leave. His system was still humming, not from danger, from recognition. He saw a signature in her defensive runes, the signature of a lonely person who was used to no one fully understanding his thoughts. A person who had long since stopped explaining and simply acted in silence. He knew that handwriting. He saw it every day, in the mirror. From the inside, the Wayland Academy looked like a city within a city. Corridors wide enough for 2 carriages, ceilings receding into the darkness, walls covered in runes that Dan read on the fly like subway signs, directional signs, warnings, protective spells, and traces of dozens of overwrites on top of the original inscriptions. Each generation of scholars had marked the walls in its own way. The official led him through 3 courtyards. Students turned to look. A ragamuffin among the robes. Dan was used to it. In his past life, he'd always looked out of place, too. At a linguist's party, he'd talk about engines. In the workshop, he'd talk about etymology. Here, he was a market vagabond among academic robes. Nothing new. The exam took place in a circular hall with an amphitheater. People sat in the upper rows. Professors. Dan counted 18. A table stood below. 5 artifacts lay on the table, and Sora Khan stood against the far wall with her arms crossed. An elderly man with a silver beard and a robe so densely embroidered that the fabric was barely visible presided. He was introduced as the Dean of Applied Theory. He looked down at Dan and said that rumors of the market repairman had reached the academy, that they wanted to make sure that this wasn't a trick, and that Dan was being asked to demonstrate his skills on 5 samples. Dan walked over to the table, the first artifact, A navigation crystal. Dead. Dan picked it up and saw the problem in 3 seconds. The rune matrix had been inscribed in reverse. Someone had mixed up the top and bottom when copying the ancient blueprint. The error was 200 years old. The artifact had never worked properly. The mages who used it had simply gotten used to its glitches and compensated for them manually. Dan flipped the crystal over. He asked for some chalk, and he inscribed a single corrective rune. The crystal glowed with an even green light and slowly turned toward the north. Silence in the hall. The second artifact, a thermal regulator. More complicated, 3 layers of a runic network. Dan saw that the problem wasn't a malfunction but a conflict between the second and third layers. They had been inscribed by different masters at different times, and they were literally arguing with each other inside the artifact. He erased 2 runes from the second layer and replaced them with hybrid ones, none of which were in any textbook, but which he had seen in the crystal structure from the village. The regulator started working. A gentle warmth flowed through the hall. Third, fourth, fifth. The same thing every time. Dan watched, saw, repaired, quickly, precisely, without unnecessary movements. He spent the most time on the 5th artifact, not because it was difficult, but because he saw something unexpected. The 5th artifact was a clock. An ancient magical clock that showed not only the time but also the phases of the moon and the positions of the stars. It hadn't worked for 70 years, and Dan saw why. The clock was connected to the lighthouse by a thin runic thread, invisible, and that thread had been severed. Not from the outside, from inside the lighthouse. As if someone or something inside the lighthouse had gnawed through the connection. Dan repaired the clock. He respun the thread, but his hands were shaking as he did it, because he had seen marks on the break, not from natural decay. Marks of something that had been eating away at it, gnawing, devouring. He finished. He stood up. He looked at the dean. The room was silent. 18 professors sat motionless. Sora Khan, standing by the wall, no longer had her arms crossed. She leaned forward. Her eyes were wide open. Dan saw something flash behind her cold facade. Not admiration, recognition. She saw something familiar in his work. The dean cleared his throat and asked where Dan had studied. Dan told the truth. Nowhere. Nowhere in this world. The dean didn't believe him. But the proof lay on the table. 5 functioning artifacts, one of which had been silent for 70 years. They hired him, formally as a junior assistant, the lowest rung of the academic hierarchy. A room in the basement wing, a salary barely enough for food, but access to the library, access to the workshops, access to knowledge. Dan didn't haggle. He didn't need status. He needed books. On his very first evening, he went to the library and met Evelyn Reed. She was standing between the 3-story-high shelves arranging books. Red hair, a soft face, thick-rimmed glasses. She saw him and smiled as if she'd been waiting. Not for him specifically, just for someone. The library was empty. Evening. Everyone had left. She said her name was Evelyn, head of the archives. She asked what he needed. Dan said he needed everything. She laughed, quietly. Warmth. She said she'd never had a request like that before. Usually people come for a specific book, but he came for all of them. She led him through the library, showed him the sections, explained the catalog system. And Dan saw something she herself didn't realize. Her catalog system was brilliant. Cross-references. Thematic bridges between disciplines. Subtle connections she had built up over years of work. Without this system, finding anything in the chaos of post-silence fragments would be impossible. She had created a map of knowledge, and she didn't even realize it. She considered herself merely a custodian, a bookkeeper to the geniuses. Dan told her this, straight out. He told her that her catalog wasn't just a storage system, that it was the only working attempt to tie the world's fragmented knowledge into a single whole, and that without it, his abilities would be useless. Because he could complete the formula, but first he needed to find all its fragments, and finding fragments was her gift. Evelyn froze. She looked at him as if he had told her something she had been waiting for her whole life. Then she adjusted her glasses. She blinked a few times, and quietly said she would show him the locked shelves, the ones even the professors rarely visit. They talked until dawn. Dan read. Evelyn found them, he asked. She pulled out the right volumes in seconds. She knew every shelf, every scroll, every fragment of text in her archive. By morning, Dan had mastered 3 dead languages. Not because they were difficult, but because his system absorbed the entire structure of the language in minutes. Grammar, phonetics, idioms, everything became transparent. He also learned something disturbing. The 3 beacons that had gone out over the past year were aligned in a straight line. He found this in the old reports that Evelyn kept tucked away in a far corner, reports that no one had requested in years. The line led to Wayland. It was no coincidence. Something was moving. Toward them. In the morning, he returned to his basement room. He lay down on the narrow cot. He closed his eyes, and he heard it. Quietly. Barely audible. The same voice as in the ruins. The voice from the book. It said one word. Careful. And fell silent. The first week at the academy was like the first day at a new job, except the job was in a world where the laws of physics had footnotes and the formulas had gaps. Dan was assigned to the basement wing. Former storage rooms converted into living quarters for junior staff. Damp walls, a ceiling covered in stains, a bed that creaked with every breath. But Dan didn't care. He had slept on the floor in the ruins in the rain a week ago. After that, any roof was a luxury. His official duties were simple: carry materials, wash flasks, sort samples. The kind of work they gave to those they wanted to keep in their place. But Dan didn't take offense. He did everything quickly and went to the library to see Evelyn. Every evening, every night. He read, and she found. They worked like a well-oiled machine. He described a fragment of a formula he'd seen in an artifact. Within a minute, she'd pull out 3 scrolls from different eras containing similar fragments. He pieced them together. She connected the dots. In the first week, Dan read more than the average student does in a semester. And he didn't just read, he understood everything. He memorized everything. He connected it all into a single picture that grew in his mind like a crystal. On the 3rd day, Sora Khan summoned him. An office on the 4th floor, sterile, not a single unnecessary item. A desk, a chair, a shelf with books arranged by the color of their spines. The perfect order of a person who controls everything she can control because inside there is chaos. Dan saw it instantly. He saw how tense her shoulders were, how perfectly straight every object stood, how she held her pen, too tightly. Sora said she wanted to understand what he had done with the clock during the exam, specifically with the 5th artifact, specifically that hybrid rune he had used. She said that rune didn't exist in any catalog. Dan explained, simply, without jargon. He said that a standard rune wouldn't work because the clock was linked to the beacon and the connection was damaged, and that he created a rune that acts as a bridge between 2 incompatible systems. Sora was silent. Then she stood up. She walked over to the shelf. She took out a notebook, an old one, a worn one, the only item in the room that didn't look perfect. She opened the notebook to the last page. There was a formula, unfinished. The handwriting wasn't hers, older, less neat. She said it was her teacher's work, Professor Einar's. He had died 8 years ago while trying to repair an artifact in the field. The formula remained unfinished. Sora had struggled with it all these years. 8 years. And she couldn't finish it. Dan looked at the formula. 10 seconds. He saw the problem. Professor Einar had been working on the same principle Dan had used on the exam. A bridge between incompatible systems. Only Einar started from theory, while Dan started from practice. Einar had tried to derive a universal rule. Dan had simply sensed the shape of the gap. But the essence was the same. And Dan saw that Einar was missing one element. One link. One chain that would connect the 2 halves of the formula. Dan asked for chalk. Sora handed it to him. He walked over to the blackboard on the wall and added 3 symbols. 3 symbols that weren't in any textbook. Symbols he saw not with his eyes, but with that new sense the voice from the book had given him. Sora looked at the board. Her face didn't change, but her hands trembled. She saw. She understood. The 3 symbols completed the formula. 8 years of work. Einar's entire career. His life. It all came together. Sora was silent for 2 minutes. Dan didn't rush her. He saw what was happening. He saw how something inside her was breaking and reassembling. For 8 years she had carried that unfinished formula like a wound, like a debt to a dead teacher. And now someone had come along and solved it in 10 seconds. She should have hated him for it. or admired him. She did neither. She asked how he knew. Dan told the truth. He doesn't know. He sees. The way others see color or hear sound. He sees how things are put together, and he sees what they're missing. Sora said that was impossible. Dan said he knew. She almost smiled. Almost. The corner of her lips twitched a millimeter. For Sora Khan, that was the equivalent of laughter. She said she would take him into her lab, formally as a lab assistant. In reality, because she needed to understand how his gift worked. Dan agreed. The next day, he worked in 2 places. In the morning, in Sora's lab. In the evening, at the library with Evelyn. And during the day. During the day, something happened that changed everything. He was walking down a corridor on the lower level of the academy, where no one went. Old lecture halls, locked workshops, dust, and a sound. A crash, then smoke. Then someone's scream. Not from pain, from frustration. Dan ran toward the sound. The door at the end of the corridor was open. Inside was a workshop, littered with the debris of something mechanical. A girl stood in the middle, young, 21, maybe 20, short hair sticking out in all directions, her face covered in soot, her sleeves rolled up. And lying on the floor in front of her was... He didn't immediately realize what it was. A structure made of metal and crystals, vaguely resembling a human figure, about the size of a large dog. It wasn't moving. Smoke was coming from it. The girl was kicking it with her foot and saying something in a slang that Dan hadn't learned yet. Judging by the tone, it was cursing. Dan coughed. She turned around. She looked at him, at his junior assistant's robe, and she said that if he'd come to check for a safety violation, he could go back because she'd already been fined so many times that one more or one less didn't matter. Dan said he wasn't an inspector. He asked what it was. She froze. Then she lit up, literally, like a light bulb that had been switched on. She said it was a golem, her own design, an autonomous magical construct designed to help with routine lab tasks. Hand her tools, mix reagents, clean up after her. She'd been working on it for 2 years. The idea was brilliant. The execution? Not so much. She introduced herself. Minji Oh, a third-year student, Department of Applied Constructology, and the dean's office's biggest headache. Dan looked at the golem, and he saw it. The idea was truly brilliant. Minji had devised a runic architecture that wasn't in a single textbook. Fresh, bold, not built on the ruins of the past, but created from scratch. The problem was that the architecture was ahead of her skills. She saw the goal, but her hands couldn't quite reach it. The rune outlines were drawn crookedly, not because she wasn't trying, but because precision required experience she didn't yet have. Dan crouched down next to the golem. Minji tensed up. She was used to adult mages looking at her work and shaking their heads, saying it was nonsense, that she needed to learn the basics first, that she was an upstart. Dan was silent. He was studying. Then he said that the architecture was correct, that the idea wasn't just good, but groundbreaking, and that the only problem was 3 contours that needed to be repositioned to account for the hull's curvature. He didn't do it himself. He asked her for tools, and showed her, right here, like this. Move this rune 2 fingers to the left. Rotate this one, and replace this one with one like this. He was drawing on the floor with charcoal. She watched. Her eyes grew wider and wider. She picked it up on the fly, faster than anyone Dan had ever taught, including himself. Minji grabbed the tools and in 40 minutes transferred the outlines, with her own hands. Following his instructions, but with her own hands. The golem twitched. It stood up. It turned its head. It looked at Minji, and picked up the wrench from the floor that she had dropped. She cried, quietly, turning away. But Dan saw. 2 years. For 2 years she had been building it, and no one believed her. And now, here it stands, working, doing what it was created to do. She asked through her tears what his name was. Dan said his name was Dan, that he was the junior assistant, and that he would come back tomorrow if she didn't mind. She didn't mind. That's how he came to have 3 anchors at the academy. Sora, who wanted to understand his gift, Evelyn, who helped him use it, and Minji, who reminded him why all this was necessary. 3 women, 3 geniuses, 3 kinds of loneliness that he saw as clearly as runic formulas. And somewhere high above the spires, the lighthouse was fading. Every day a little paler than yesterday. A month had passed. Dan was no longer a ragged kid from the market. He was the academy's enigma, the junior assistant whom Professor Sora Han had taken into her lab, the vagabond who had repaired 5 artifacts in 10 minutes, the outsider who read dead languages like this morning's newspaper. Rumors crept through the hallways. Some said he was a spy from a rival academy. Someone said he was a descendant of an ancient lineage hiding his origins. Someone said he was just a fraud who would soon be exposed. Dan didn't care. He had a job, a real job, for the first time in his life. In the morning, he worked with Sora. She gave him broken formulas. He fixed them. She wrote down every step. She tried to derive a method, to understand the rule by which he filled in the missing pieces. So far, without success, because there was no rule. There was a vision. There was a sense of form, like explaining to a blind person what red is. In the afternoon, he went down to Minji. She was refining the golem. Every day, a new function. Every day, a new explosion. Dan guided her, demonstrated, explained, but he never did it for her. That was a matter of principle. He wasn't fixing an object, he was fixing her confidence. Minji began to believe in herself. She stopped looking over her shoulder, expecting ridicule. She started showing the golem to her classmates. They watched and couldn't believe their eyes. In the evenings, he would go to Evelyn's. The library became his second home. He read. She brewed tea. A strange local herbal tea that Dan couldn't identify despite his system. Not because he didn't understand their structure, but because brewing tea turned out to be the only thing his system refused to recognize as a task. He understood the chemistry of the leaves. He understood the water temperature. He understood the steeping time. And yet, every time, he ended up with a murky bitterness instead of that warm, golden drink that Evelyn made with a single motion. She laughed, quietly, behind his back. And she said that some things can't be understood. You have to live them. It infuriated and comforted him at the same time. By the end of the month, Dan had discovered something important. Beneath the main academy building was an abandoned level. Old workshops, old laboratories, sealed off after some incident 30 years ago. He found it by accident. He went down the wrong corridor. He saw a sealed door, and he saw that the seal on it was child's play. 3 runic locks, each with a flaw in the design. Whoever set these seals, he wasn't locking the door. He was hiding it, making it look locked to those who didn't understand. Dan understood. He went inside. 3 rooms, stone walls covered with formulas from floor to ceiling, workbenches, tools, crystals, everything covered in dust but intact, and the formulas on the walls. Dan stood and read. These weren't textbook formulas. These were research notes. Someone had been working here 30 years ago, working on the Myox, trying to figure out why they went out. And judging by the formulas, that someone had been close to the answer. The last entry on the wall trailed off mid-sentence, as if the author had been interrupted, or stopped. Dan decided to make these workshops his own. He didn't ask for permission. Permission meant bureaucracy, and bureaucracy meant questions he didn't have convenient answers for. He just started coming here. He brought candles, tools. He hauled some books from the library with Evelyn's permission, cleared off one table, then a second, then a third. A week later, he brought Minji here. She needed space for the golem. Upstairs, she was constantly getting complaints about the noise and explosions. Down here, no one could hear. Minji saw the workshops and her eyes lit up. She hauled in tools, materials, blueprints. In a single day, she turned one of the halls into her lab. Then Evelyn came. She brought shelves, books, index cards. She organized a miniature archive in the corner. Sora was the last to arrive. She didn't ask. She just showed up at the door one evening. She looked at the formulas on the walls, at Minji's golem at work, at Evelyn arranging books, at Dan bent over a fragment of an ancient drawing, and she stayed. She took the fourth table, spread out her notes, and began to work. Silently, nearby. For the first time, not alone. Dan didn't comment. He saw what was happening. 4 people who had each been alone had found a place where loneliness receded. Not because they spoke of their feelings, but because they were working side by side. Side by side. Each on their own task, but together. It was then that what he had been waiting for and fearing happened. The lighthouse flickered. It didn't dim. It didn't weaken. It flickered. Like a light bulb before it burns out. The whole city saw it. The whole city froze. For a single second, Wayland's beacon went out. And for a single second, Dan saw. His system flared so brightly he clutched his head. He saw the beacon from the inside. The runic structure, thousands of layers, millions of connections, and among them, something alien, something dark, something that was eating away at the crystal from the inside, slowly, methodically, with relish. It wasn't a natural process. The beacon wasn't fading. The beacon was being devoured. A second passed. The beacon lit up again, weaker than before. The city exhaled. People chalked it up to chance, to a fluctuation, to anything, just so they wouldn't have to think about the terrible. Dan stood in his underground workshop and stared at the ceiling. He knew it wasn't a coincidence. He saw the marks, the same ones on the clock during the exam, the same ones on the scraps of old notes on the walls. Someone was feeding on the lighthouse, and that someone was eating faster and faster. He told Evelyn. She turned pale. She pulled out the old reports, the ones he'd already seen. 3 lighthouses in a row. But now she'd found something else. Records of an incident 30 years ago. The very one that led to the basement level being sealed off. A researcher named Professor Marin was studying the nature of the beacons. He discovered an anomaly in the crystal structure. He reported it to management and disappeared. The laboratory was sealed off. His work was confiscated. Officially, he died in an accident. But Evelyn found his last letter, written the day before his disappearance, addressed to a colleague who was already dead as well. There was one phrase in the letter that Dan remembered. Marin wrote that the Mayaks don't just store knowledge, they are alive, and something has come to devour them. Dan looked at Evelyn. She looked at him. They both knew they had just crossed the line. The knowledge they had found was dangerous. The voice from the book had warned them. Every forbidden piece of knowledge leaves a trace, and they can come following that trace. Sora walked into the workshop at that moment. She saw their faces and stopped. She asked what had happened. Dan decided not to lie. He told her everything. About the Mayaks flickering, about what he'd seen inside, about Marin's notes, about the 3 beacons on the line. Sora listened in silence. Her expression didn't change. But Dan saw how her fingers, clenching the edge of the table, had turned white. When he finished, she asked one question. She asked how much time they had. Dan said he didn't know, but that the beacon was growing weaker, and that whatever was consuming it was doing so faster and faster, like a parasite that grows along with its appetite. Maybe months, maybe weeks. Sora nodded. Then she did something Dan didn't expect. She took a chain with a small crystal from around her neck, the professor's personal seal, the key to all the laboratories of the Department of Runic Structure, and she placed it on the table in front of him. She said that now they were working together, not as professor and assistant, as equals, and that if he could see what she was talking about, she didn't care where he came from or how he did it. Dan took the crystal, small, warm from her body, and he thought that in his old world no one had ever trusted him like this. Somewhere above, the Wayland beacon burned a little dimmer than yesterday, and somewhere in the darkness, whatever was eating away at him raised its head and sniffed, at the new scent, at the scent of the one who had begun to understand too much. The next morning, after the lighthouse flickered, the academy shook. Not an earthquake, panic. The professors gathered for an emergency council meeting. The students were sent to their classrooms. Guards blocked the entrances to the upper terraces. The official version went like this. A brief fluctuation in the energy core, a natural process, nothing to worry about. Dan knew it was a lie, and he wasn't the only one.
Grandmaster Alistair Vaughn stood at the council podium and spoke in a steady, confident voice. Dan was seeing him for the first time. Tall, lean, a face carved from stone, a black robe with silver trim. His eyes were gray and cold as steel in winter. He said that the beacon was stable, that the flickering was a normal phenomenon recorded in the chronicles 400 years ago, that panic was unwarranted, that the academy was in control of the situation. Dan sat in the back row. Junior assistants weren't supposed to attend the council, but Sora had brought him in as her lab assistant. He watched Vaughn, and his system was working. Quietly, without flashes. It was dissecting the Grand Master like an artifact, layer by layer. Gestures rehearsed, voice modulated, every pause calculated. This was not the speech of a man who believed in his own words. It was the speech of a man who wanted others to believe. Vaughn knew that the beacon was dying, and he didn't just know. He was calm. The calm of a man who had already made a decision. Dan couldn't tell which one. His system read people, but not thoughts. He saw fear hidden behind confidence. He saw calculation hidden behind concern. He saw a man who had long since stopped serving knowledge and had begun to serve something else. After the council meeting, Dan went down to the workshop. Sora was already there, and she wasn't alone. Standing next to her was a woman Dan didn't know, tall, slender. She wasn't wearing the Academy's robe, but a travel suit made of thick fabric with embroidery that cost more than Dan had earned in an entire month. Dark chestnut hair was gathered into a practical braid. Her face was beautiful and stern at the same time. Her eyes were green and alert, like a cat's before a pounce. An artifact hung from her belt, the compass. Dan saw it, and his system flared up. The compass was ancient, a genuine work from the pre-silence era. The runic network was as fine as a spider web, 12 layers. And it wasn't working, not fully. The needle trembled, it pointed somewhere, but not precisely, as if the compass could see the target but couldn't quite reach it. Sora said it was Princess Cassandra Vale. Dan blinked. A princess? In his basement workshop, between Minji's homemade golem and Evelyn's bookcases. Cassandra didn't wait for him to recover. She said she had arrived in Wayland 3 days ago by order of the Crown, to investigate the beacon's flickering, and that she needed a man who could fix the unfixable, because she had an artifact that no one had been able to repair. She placed the compass on the table. Dan walked over. He picked it up. 10 seconds. He saw it. The compass was calibrated to a specific object. Not north, not the city. Something that was moving, or hiding. The needle was trembling because the object was far away and the compass lacked power. But that wasn't the problem. The problem was the calibration. The compass was set to a target set by someone else. Not Cassandra. One of her ancestors. The Crown. The compass was searching for what the Crown needed, and Cassandra wanted to find else. Dan looked at her. She looked back. Not a trace of servility. Not a trace of fear. She stood in the basement before her ragged assistant and waited. Not like a princess awaiting service. Like a researcher awaiting an answer. Dan asked what she was really looking for. Not what the Crown had ordered her to look for. What she herself wanted to find. Cassandra froze. Then she tilted her head slightly. Her eyes narrowed. She said it was none of his business. Dan said it was his business if she wanted the compass to work, because the artifact could only be calibrated to the owner's true goal.
He hadn't heard that from anyone else. He had simply seen it in the compass's structure. An ancient master had built in a safeguard against false targets. The compass refused to lead to anything the owner's heart wasn't truly seeking. Cassandra was silent for a long time. Then she said she was looking for the source, the original source of knowledge, the place from which the Mayaki came, not for the crown, for herself. Because she believes that if she finds the source, she can understand why the Mayaki are fading, and stop it. Dan took a piece of coal. He reconfigured the 3 runic circuits in the compass. He didn't break the old calibration. He shifted it, from the crown's target to Cassandra's. The needle stopped trembling. It pointed southwest, steadily, firmly, without hesitation. Cassandra took the compass. Her hand paused for a moment. Dan saw something flicker across her face. Not gratitude, shock. For the first time, someone had done what she needed. Not what the crown needed through her, but what she needed. She said she'd be back, that she needed time to process the data, and she left, quickly, as if afraid to show she was feeling too much. Sora watched her go. Then she looked at Dan. She asked if he knew he'd just reconfigured a royal artifact without the crown's permission. That technically, that was treason. Dan said he hadn't known. Sora said she knew now, and that she didn't care, because the needle had pointed southwest, and southwest of Wayland stood one of the extinguished beacons. Dan spent the next few days working, but now the work was different. Before, he had repaired artifacts. Now he was studying the beacon. With Sora's help, he gained access to the lower levels of the tower where the crystal hung. There were control panels there, runic monitors, systems that once monitored the beacon's health. Half of them weren't working. A quarter were malfunctioning. Dan repaired them one by one, and each repaired panel revealed a new piece of the picture to him. Something was eating away at the beacon from the inside. A parasite. Not a physical one, a runic one.
Like a virus woven into the very structure of the crystal. It was ancient, older than the lighthouse, as if someone had planted it during its creation, or as if it had come from the lighthouses themselves had come from. Dan found the parasite on the 9th day of his research, and on that very day, they found him. He was working in the control room late at night, alone. Sora had left 2 hours ago. Evelyn was sleeping in the library, curled up against a bookshelf. Minji had taken the golem away for further work. Silence. And footsteps. The control room door opened. 2 people entered. Men in gray robes without insignia, their faces covered. They said nothing. The first raised his hand, and a spell crashed down on Dan. Not a combat spell. Restraining. Invisible chains wrapped around his body. He couldn't move, couldn't speak, could only see. And he saw. The structure of the spell. 7 layers of runes. Rough work but powerful. Military magic, not academic.
The second man approached the panels. He began to do something. Dan couldn't turn his head, but out of the corner of his eye he saw the man entering runes into the control system. Runes that Dan recognized. The same ones he had seen inside the lighthouse. A runic parasite. This man hadn't studied it. He'd fed it, fueled it, accelerated the process. Someone was deliberately killing the lighthouse, and that someone had access to the Academy's control room. Dan couldn't move, but he could think, and he could see. He studied the spell binding his body. 7 layers, 6 were flawless. The 7th contained an error, a tiny one, barely noticeable. The circuit wasn't quite closed, like the axle of a wagon about to snap. Dan couldn't dispel the spell. He didn't have the magical reserves for it, but he didn't need to dispel it. He needed to break it. 1 rune, the 7th, the one that held everything together. He tensed his right hand, all he had. All the physical strength of an ordinary 27-year-old man. No magic, muscles. He moved his finger 2 centimeters and touched the rune outline on the floor, the outline under the binding spell, and ran his fingernail along it once. exactly along the line of the seventh layer. The spell burst, quietly, like a soap bubble. The two turned around. Dan was already on his feet. He ran, not toward them, away from them, toward the door, down the hallway, up the stairs. He ran and screamed, not a spell, a name. The name Sora Khan, because her room was the closest, and because if there was a person in the world whose combat spell could stop two military mages, it was Sora Khan. She appeared from the doorway of her room 6 seconds later, in a nightgown, with disheveled hair, with eyes in which there was neither sleep nor fear, only cold, precise fury. Dan shouted that there were two in the control room, that they were feeding the parasite, that they were hastening the Mayak's demise.
Sora didn't ask a single question. She walked past him, down the stairs. He ran after her. The control room was empty. The two had vanished, but traces remained. Runes on the panels, fresh, still glowing. And the smell. A heavy, sweetish smell that Dan couldn't identify. Sora identified it. She said it was the smell of licorice oil. Rare, expensive. One that only one person in Wayland used. She didn't name a name, but she looked up, toward the upper floors, where the Grand Master's office was located. They stood in the silence of the control room. The beacon above them burned slightly dimmer than an hour ago, and both knew that the enemy wasn't outside. The enemy sat at the very heart of the academy. That morning, Dan didn't go to Juan, not because he was afraid, but because he understood. Understanding was his weapon and his curse. He understood that Juan had held his position for 30 years, that he had connections in every department, that his word was worth more than the word of 10 professors, and the word of a junior assistant was worth nothing. To accuse the Grand Master of sabotaging the beacon without proof meant destroying himself, not Juan. Dan gathered his team in the basement workshop: Sora, Evelyn, Minji. He told them everything, from the very beginning, about the voice in the ruins, about the system, about the parasite, about the night visitors, about the smell of licorice oil. Minji listened with her mouth agape. Evelyn turned pale and took off her glasses to wipe them. She always wiped her glasses when she was nervous. Sora stood against the wall and didn't move. When Dan finished, she asked one question. She asked what he was proposing. Dan said they couldn't attack Vona, but they could do something else. They could strengthen the beacon. If the parasite was eating the crystal from the inside, then they could feed the crystal from the outside. Slow down the process. Buy time. And while the parasite is busy digesting new food, study it enough to find a way to kill it. For that, he needed the formulas, the ones on the workshop walls. Professor Marin's work, the very same one who disappeared 30 years ago. Marin was close to the answer. His formulas on the walls were drafts of a method for feeding the beacons, not repairs, feeding. He was developing a way to supply the Mayaks with energy from the outside, like an IV drip for a patient. The formulas were incomplete, of course. In this world, everything was incomplete. But Dan saw the gaps, and he saw how to fill them. For a week, they worked like madmen. Sora translated Dan's visions into working formulas. What he intuitively, she clothed in precise runic notation. They complemented each other. He saw the whole. She built the details. He said there should be a bridge here. She calculated the exact length and strength of that bridge. Evelyn searched. Using the fragments Dan provided, she found the missing pieces in the archives. A scroll from the Southern Collection containing 3 runes found nowhere else. A plaque from the Eastern Repository describing the resonant frequencies of crystals. A century-old letter from an unknown mage who had observed the beacon in operation and described its pulse with precision down to the beat. Without Evelyn, this would have been impossible. No system could replace a person who knew every shelf of every bookcase in a library the size of a city block. Minji was building. Formulas on paper were useless without a physical device that could bring them to life. A resonator was needed, a device that would capture energy from the surrounding space and direct it into the beacon. Minji designed it from scratch, based on her golem, the same architecture, the same principles, but on a larger scale, more complex. Dan directed, she built. The golem helped, carried parts, held tools. Once he tried to solder a circuit on his own and started a small fire. Minji put it out with a blanket and explained to the golem that soldering wasn't his job yet. The golem nodded.
Dan suspected the nod was an accident. Minji insisted the golem was learning. On the fourth day of work, Cassandra came to the workshop. Without warning. She had a knack for showing up unexpectedly. A princess in a basement amid soot and formulas. She said the compass had led her back. Not to the southwestern lighthouse, to Dan. The needle had spun around overnight and pointed to the academy, to the lower level, to him. Dan understood. The compass was tuned to the source of knowledge, to the original source. And right now, in this basement, the concentration of new knowledge was higher than anywhere else in the world. Because here, Dan was creating something that didn't exist. The Mayak's nutritional formula. Cassandra looked at the walls, at the blueprints, at the formulas. She was a scientist. Not just a princess playing at science, a real scientist. And she saw the scale of it. Dan saw her pupils dilate, saw her start calculating in her head, saw her fingers twitch involuntarily toward a pen to take notes. She asked if she could stay. She didn't order it. She asked. Dan nodded. Cassandra took off her traveling cloak, rolled up her sleeves, and got to work. She turned out to be a mathematician, a brilliant one. What Sora expressed in runic formulas, Cassandra translated into numbers, probabilities, load calculations, models of the crystal's behavior under the influence of additional energy. She calculated faster than Dan could even grasp what needed to be calculated. For the first time, his system acknowledged that someone was doing something faster than he was. Not in understanding, in processing. Cassandra didn't grasp the essence the way he did. But she processed the data so quickly it took his breath away. 5 people, 5 sets of skills, 1 task. Dan saw how they fit together, like cogs in a mechanism. Sora creates the runic foundation. Evelyn provides the information. Minji builds the device. Cassandra calculates the parameters. And he sees the whole, connects, guides. Tells Sora that this rune must resonate with the number Cassandra found. Tells Minji that this circuit needs to be bent at the angle Evelyn determined in the old scroll. A conductor. He was the conductor. And the orchestra played. On the 7th day, the resonator was ready. A clunky contraption made of metal and crystals, the size of a chair, ugly, bulky. Minji apologized for its appearance. Dan said that beauty could wait. The main thing was that it worked. That night they climbed the lighthouse tower. 5 people, 1 golem, 1 resonator. Dan carried the device himself. Minji tried to help, but he refused. The resonator had to be activated at the base of the crystal, where the lighthouse's rune network came to the surface. Dan set up the device. Plugged it in, the runes on the casing lit up, a quiet hum, a vibration. The resonator began to work. It drew energy from the air, from the stone, from the very fabric of space, and poured it into the lighthouse. The crystal shuddered and glowed brighter, just a little, barely noticeable, but it glowed. The parasite inside sensed new nourishment and loosened its grip for a second. Like a leech offered fresh blood. It wasn't a victory, it was a respite. But for the first time in 30 years, something had given Mayak a respite. Dan stood at the top of the tower and looked at the glowing crystal. 4 women stood nearby. Each had invested a piece of herself in that moment. Her knowledge, her time, their faith. He looked at them and for the first time thought that maybe the voice from the book was right. Maybe the gift wasn't given so that he could understand the world, but so that he could understand how not to be alone. Then he looked down, into the academy courtyard, and saw a figure, a black silhouette at the base of the tower, standing and looking up at them. Dan couldn't see the face, but he saw the robe, black with silver. Alistair Vaughn knew. The blow came 2 days later, not a physical one, a bureaucratic one. Dan received a notice of disciplinary proceedings, 3 charges. Unauthorized access to sealed premises, use of academic equipment without permission, and interference with the work of the Mayak. The last one was serious. Interference with the Mayak was punishable by expulsion from the academy and a prison sentence. The complaint was filed by a low-level administrator, but Dan saw Vaughn's hand behind the paper. Slender, neat. The hand of a man who had run the institution for 30 years and knew every lever. The hearing was scheduled for 3 days later. Sora came to the workshop pale with rage.
She said she would try to block the proceedings through the academic council, that she had the votes. Dan said no. He said that if she entered into open conflict with the magistrate, she would lose her chair. And without a chair, she would lose access to the labs. And without the labs, their work would grind to a halt. Sora clenched her teeth. She hated it when he was right. Evelyn suggested something else. She said there was a precedent in the archives. 120 years ago, a student gained access to sealed rooms and was not punished because his work was recognized as a scientific breakthrough. The rule went like this. If the result of the research is of exceptional value to the Academy, a violation of procedure may be justified upon public demonstration of the result. A public demonstration. Dan had to show what he had done and why, in front of the entire Academy. It was both a trap and an opportunity. A trap because Juan would be in the hall, and he would be ready. An opportunity because Dan knew something Juan didn't. He knew about the parasite, and he knew that Juan was feeding it. If Dan revealed this publicly, Juan would have to either admit the fact or deny the obvious in front of witnesses. 3 days of preparation. Sora helped format the results into an academic style. Cassandra provided mathematical models bearing her signature. The princess's signature on a scientific document was worth a lot, not because Cassandra was a princess, but because her reputation as a scientist was impeccable. Minji prepared a visual demonstration. Her golem carried a miniature model of the Mayak the size of a fist, with a parasite inside, a real one. A small fragment of the runic parasite that Dan had extracted from the control panel and placed in a container. Evelyn found the documents, reports on Marin's work, records of his disappearance, inconsistencies in the official version, everything neatly filed and numbered. The day of the hearing. The Academy's Great Hall, the very same one where Dan had taken his exam. Only now the amphitheater was full. Not 18 professors, hundreds, faculty, senior students, administrative staff. Word of the hearing had spread through the Academy like wildfire. Everyone wanted to see the junior assistant expelled in disgrace. He sat there in the front row, calm, confident, a slight smile, the smile of a man who knows the outcome. Dan stepped into the center of the hall. He looked at the hundreds of faces, and he began. He didn't defend himself. He didn't make excuses. He demonstrated. First, the Mayak model. Golem Minji carried it to the center of the hall and placed it on the podium. The crystal inside the model glowed, dimly, painfully. Dan said that a parasite lived inside Mayak Wayland, a runic construct of unknown origin. It feeds on the knowledge stored within the crystal. The hall buzzed. Dan raised his hand and activated the model. The container holding a fragment of the parasite glowed with a dark red light inside the crystal. Everyone in the hall saw it. Black veins crawling across the crystal, devouring the light. Silence. Then he showed Marin's formulas, a projection on the wall, the work of the man who discovered the parasite 30 years ago and disappeared. The room was silent. Dan looked at Vaughn. Vaughn wasn't smiling anymore. His face was stony. Dan didn't accuse him, didn't name names, didn't point fingers. He simply laid out the facts. The parasite exists. Someone knew about it 30 years ago. That someone was stopped. But the parasite remained and grew. Then he showed the results. Data from the tower, before and after the resonator was installed. The figures Cassandra had collected. The beacon had strengthened by 4%. Insignificant. But for the first time in 30 years, for the first time, someone had halted the decline. The room buzzed. 4% wasn't much, but the direction was more important than the number. Vaughn stood up, calmly. He said the presentation was interesting but proved nothing. That the parasite could be a natural formation. That Marin's formulas had been rejected by the Scientific Council 30 years ago for good reason. And that unauthorized interference with the beacon's operations was dangerous regardless of the outcome. He spoke well, convincingly. Every word measured, every argument was on point. Dan could see the room wavering. Some believed him, some believed Vorn. And then Sora stood up. She didn't ask to speak. She simply stood up and began to speak. She said she had personally verified every formula. That the rune structure of the parasite was not a natural formation. That it was a construct, created intentionally, with a specific purpose. She spoke the language of formulas, the only language the Academy accepted unconditionally. Then Cassandra stood up. She said that the mathematical model confirmed the conclusions, and that the Crown was interested in continuing the research. She didn't make any threats, but everyone understood what the Crown's interest meant. Vaughn paled. By half a shade, barely noticeable, but Dan saw it. The vote was quick. The charges were dropped. The research was deemed admissible. The workshops in the basement were officially assigned to Dan as an experimental laboratory. Formally, he remained a junior assistant. In reality, he had just defeated the Grand Master in his own hall. Vaughn approached him after the meeting. His face was calm. His voice was quiet. He said he was impressed, and that Dan should be careful, because the parasite isn't the only thing lurking in the shadows. He said it with a smile, like advice, like concern, and he left. Dan stood there watching him go. His system was analyzing every word, every inflection, every micro-expression. One wasn't scared. He was annoyed, like a chess player who'd lost a pawn. Not a piece, a pawn. He'd lost a round and was already planning the next one. Dan understood. The war had only just begun. The 2 weeks following the hearing passed in tense silence. One made no new moves. That was more unsettling than an open attack. Dan worked, every day, every night. The resonator on the tower kept the beacon stable. 4% turned into 6, then 7. The parasite didn't disappear, but its growth slowed. The beacon stopped fading, for now. But Dan knew this was a temporary measure. The resonator fed the beacon. The parasite fed on the beacon. It was a race. Who would gain more? And the parasite had the advantage. It was inside. The resonator was outside. A different solution was needed. The parasite had to be killed. To do that, Dan had to understand what the parasite was. Not just see, to truly understand. Where it came from, who created it, why, and how it was connected to what was devouring the beacons all over the world. The answer came from where he least expected it. She appeared at the workshop door on the 6th day of the 2nd week. Calm, quiet, in a long, hooded cloak. When she pulled back the hood, Dan saw her face. Young, but tired. A shaved temple, long dark hair on the other side, and a tattoo on her neck, a rune. Dan read it instantly, the rune of the forgotten god. The woman said her name was Leah, that she was a priestess of the forgotten god, that she had been searching for him for 2 months, following a trail. Dan asked what kind of trail. Leah said that every time he used his gift, he left a mark, like a scent, like a sound at a frequency only those who have dedicated their lives to listening can hear. She had been listening her whole life, 28 years, ever since she was brought to the temple as a 6-year-old girl. 22 years of prayers addressed to a God who did not answer. 22 years of faith without a single sign. And 2 months ago, she heard it. A faint ringing on the edge of perception, familiar, like a voice she had never heard but recognized instantly. She followed that ringing, through 3 kingdoms, over mountain passes, through lands where the priests of the forgotten God were not loved. And she came here. She looked at Dan, and her eyes were full of something he didn't immediately recognize. Not admiration, not fear, awe. She looked at him as if he were the answer to her entire life. Dan felt uneasy. He saw her, just as he saw everyone. He saw faith woven into every cell of her body. He saw a loneliness older than his own. He saw a woman who had spent her life serving silence and had now heard music. And he saw danger, because she was looking at the heir to God, and he was just Dan Carver. A dropout from 3 universities. Someone who didn't know how to make tea. He told her that, straight up. He said he wasn't a god, not a prophet, not a messiah. That he was an ordinary man who had been given an extraordinary instrument. Leah smiled, quietly, sadly. She said that was exactly what the heir would say. Dan sighed. They were at an impasse. But Leah brought more than just faith. She brought knowledge. The Order of the Forgotten God kept records found in no library in the world, fragments of the teachings of the God of knowledge, snippets of his words, pieces of his final messages, and among them a fragment that described a parasite. Not this specific one, a parasite as a species. Leah took out a scroll, yellowed, fragile, in a language no one at the academy knew,
in the sacred tongue of the forgotten god, which was considered untranslatable. Dan read it in a minute. Leah watched. For 22 years she had carried this scroll without understanding it. For 22 years it had been a symbol of her faith, a sealed message that would one day be revealed. And now a vagrant in the basement was reading it like a note on the fridge. She wasn't offended. She was happy. For the first time, the god had answered, even if through a stranger's lips. The scroll spoke of the devourers. That was what the god called them. Beings that fed not on matter nor on energy.
They fed on understanding, on meaning, on the connections between things, on knowledge in its purest form. They were the cause of the silence of the heavens. The gods hadn't left, the gods had been devoured, one by one. The god of war, the god of craft, the god of music. Each carried within himself the structure of the world. Each was a part of the great blueprint. The devourers ate the blueprint. They turned order into chaos, understanding into emptiness. The god of knowledge was the last. He saw what had happened to the others, and instead of fleeing or fighting, he did what the devourers did not expect. He dismantled himself into pieces, scattered the fragments across the world, hid them in artifacts, in formulas, in people. The beacons were the largest fragments, repositories not just of knowledge but of parts of the god himself, his memory, his understanding, his essence. The devourers could not find the disassembled god. Searching for the whole when there is no whole is like catching water with a sieve. But they were patient and hungry. They began to eat the fragments, one beacon after another, slowly, methodically, searching in each one for a trace of the whole. And the parasites inside the beacons were their tentacles, tools for searching and devouring. Dan sat and processed. His system was working at its limit. He felt the information coming together into a picture, a huge one, a terrifying one. He was not the heir to the god of knowledge. He was a vessel, the last vessel, into which the god had placed not a fragment, but himself entirely. All the parts, all the memory, all the understanding. A voice from the book, a tired, warm, human voice. It wasn't a mediator. It was him, a forgotten version of himself, a god hiding in the body of an eternal underachiever from another world. In that one place the devourers couldn't reach, because Dan wasn't from this world. Because he didn't exist on the map of Aldorain. He was invisible. He was. Until he started fixing things, until he started leaving traces. Every repaired rune, every restored formula, every crystal that flared. These were signal fires, and the devourers were drawn to the light. Leah saw his face. She asked what was wrong. Dan said that everything was wrong, that he was a walking target, that every time he used his gift, he put not only himself but everyone around him in danger. Leah replied calmly. She said that in that case, she was lucky, because her whole life she had stood next to a target she couldn't see, and now at least she knows where to stand. Dan looked at her, and for the first time, he didn't see a priestess, not a fanatic, a woman who had made a choice, a conscious one, a difficult one, with her eyes wide open. A second figure entered beside her. Dan hadn't noticed her before. A tall woman, broad-shouldered, scars on her arms and neck, short, light hair, eyes gray as the sky before a storm. She didn't speak. She stood behind Leah like a wall. Leah said this was Tamar, her protector, a warrior priestess of the order. Tamar looked at Dan. With a single glance, she assessed the room. Exits, corners, distance to weapons. Then she nodded, not to him, to herself, like a person who had determined the perimeter and found it acceptable. Dan saw her too. He saw the scars, not just on her skin, inside. A woman who had forgotten how to want anything other than protection, who had buried herself under armor so long ago that she didn't remember what she was like without it. His gaze fell on her belt. A case hung there, small, worn. Not a weapon, something else. A case for a musical instrument, a flute, a broken one. He could see it through the leather of the case. He saw the crack in the wood. He saw the muffled rune resonators. An instrument that had been silent for as long as the god of Lee had been silent. He said nothing. Not now. It wasn't the time. But he remembered. So there were 6 of them now.
Sora, Evelyn, Minji, Cassandra, Leah, Tamar, and Dan. 7 people in the Academy's basement, against the thing that devoured stars. Dan gave himself one night to be afraid. He lay in the darkness of his basement room and stared at the ceiling. He was the vessel of a god, a walking target. Every time he repaired a broken rune or completed a formula, he lit a beacon for the creatures that devoured gods. Every time he helped someone, he was setting that person up. Logic told him to stop, to hide, to curl up in a corner and not use the gift, to become invisible again, just as he had been invisible his whole life in the old world. But in the morning he got up and went to the workshop, because the beacon was still dying, and because 6 people were waiting for him there. First, he took care of Tamar, not because she asked. She didn't ask for anything.
She stood by the workshop door and watched the others work in silence. She was a sword, a shield, a function, and she believed that was enough. Dan approached her that evening. The others had left. Leah was praying in the room she'd been given. Sora was poring over calculations. Evelyn was sleeping in the library. Minji had taken the golem for maintenance. Cassandra was writing a report for the crown. Tamar stood by the door, as always. Dan asked if he could take a look at her flute. Tamar flinched. Her hand darted toward her belt. Not toward a weapon, toward the case. A defensive gesture, like a mother shielding a child. She said no. Dan nodded. He didn't insist. Instead, he sat down on the floor next to the door and began to tell his story. About his world. About how he used to work as a machine tool technician. About how he once repaired an old lathe from the 70s and found a newspaper from that era inside. One of the workers had slipped it into the mechanism 40 years ago, and the machine had been running all this time with the newspaper inside. Because the newspaper had happened to fall in just the right way to become part of the mechanism. Take it out, and the machine would break. Tamar listened. Her face didn't change, but she was listening. Dan said that people are like machines. Sometimes what seems superfluous is actually what holds everything together. A newspaper in the mechanism, a flute in a soldier's case. Tamar was silent. Then she slowly unfastened the case. She took out the flute. She placed it on the floor between them. Dan looked at it. Wooden, long, with runic carvings along its entire length. A crack ran from the mouthpiece to the middle. 2 of the 6 runes were dead. It wasn't just a flute. It was an instrument tuned to its owner's voice. A magical resonator that transformed music into something greater. In the pre-magical era, Tamar, such instruments were part a person, an extension of the soul. Tamar said quietly that she hadn't always been a warrior. Long ago, in another life, she played. Then people with swords came, and she took up a sword to protect those who played, and never laid it down again. The flute broke in battle. She carried it with her as a reminder of who she was, and of the fact that it was no longer possible. Dan took the flute, carefully, as one would hold a newborn. He saw everything, the crack, the dead runes, the broken resonance, and he saw that it could be repaired, but not in the usual way. The crack could not be sealed. It had become part of the instrument, like a newspaper in a press. He didn't need to remove but to incorporate it into the structure, to make it part of the sound. He worked for 2 hours. Tamar sat nearby, not moving. Dan drew runes with charcoal directly onto the wood. New ones, that weren't in the original. Runes that took the crack into account, incorporated it, turned a defect into a feature. When he finished, the flute looked the same. The crack remained, but the runes around it glowed with a soft golden light. He handed the instrument to Tamar. She took it, brought it to her lips, closed her eyes, and began to play. The sound was different, not the same as it had been before the crack, deeper, warmer, with a break in it, like the voice of a person who had been crying and had stopped. There was a story in the sound, pain and acceptance, sword and music, not one instead of the other, both. Tamar played. Tears streamed down her cheeks. She didn't wipe them away. She didn't stop. She played. And somewhere in the hallway, Leah stopped. She leaned against the wall.
She closed her eyes and heard in the music what she had been searching for 22 years. A voice, not God's, something greater, pain that had become beauty. Tamar played for a long time. When she finished, she looked at Dan, not as a warrior looks at the object of her protection, not like a priestess looking at an heir, like a person looking at another person. She said one word, "Thank you." Dan nodded. The next morning he received a note, unsigned, unsealed. 2 words in a dead language that only a handful of people at the academy knew. Dan read it instantly. The words meant public duel and a date. In 5 days. Vaughn struck again. Not through bureaucracy, through tradition. The public duel was an ancient custom of the academy. Anyone could challenge anyone to an intellectual duel before the entire scholarly community. The loser lost the right to vote on the council for a year. To Dan, who had no vote anyway, this seemed harmless. But Sora turned pale when he showed her the note. She explained that a duel was not a debate. It was a trial. The challenger sets the problem. The challenged solves it. In public. If they fail, disgrace and expulsion. If they succeed, victory. But the challenger chooses the problem, and one will choose something that kills, literally. Sora reminded him of the 3 researchers who died trying to complete the incomplete formula, a protective trap within the structure. Anyone who completed it incorrectly triggered a chain reaction. 3 deaths in the last 50 years, and the formula was never solved. She was certain that this was the very formula one would present to Dan. Dan thought about it for 2 days. He could have refused. Formally, the debate was voluntary. But refusal meant cowardice, and cowardice at the academy cost more than defeat. A coward didn't lose his voice. A coward lost respect. And everyone standing next to the coward lost respect too. Sora, Evelyn, Minji, Cassandra. They had staked their reputations on him. Refusal would hurt them. Dan accepted the challenge, and he spent 3 days preparing. Not to solve the formula, he knew he would solve it. His system could break down any formula. He was preparing for a trap. Because if Sora was right, then the formula was protected, and whoever completed it incorrectly would die. 3 researchers had died because they took the standard approach, the textbook way. But the formula wasn't broken. It was locked, protected, like a safe with a false lock. Turn the right key and it explodes. Turn the wrong one and it opens. Dan spent 2 days in the library with Evelyn, studying the history of the 3 who died, their notes, their approaches, their mistakes. All 3 were brilliant scientists. All 3 found the right solution, and all 3 died precisely because it was the right one. The trap was triggered by the correct answer. Dan sat poring over the notes and smiled. For the first time, his eternal wrongness was an advantage. He never solved things the right way. He solved them his own way. The day of the debate began with rain. Dan stood by the window of the basement workshop and watched at the water running down the glass. The same rain, the same cold, just like on his first night in this world. Only now, standing behind him were 6 people who cared. The Academy's great hall was packed to the brim. Not just professors, students, townspeople, market vendors. Word of the debate had spread throughout Wayland in 3 days. Everyone wanted to see how a vagabond repairman would stand up to the Grand Master. There he stood on the podium. A black and silver robe, a calm face, a slight smile. He looked like a man who had come for a walk, not for an execution. Dan stepped into the center of the hall, alone. Sora wanted to stand beside him. He refused. If something went wrong, the explosion would kill whoever was standing closest. She didn't argue, but he saw her fingers turn white on the armrest of the chair. He began. He spoke at length, eloquently, about the Academy's traditions, about the importance of intellectual honesty, about how knowledge must be tested. Every word was poison in a sugar coating. Then he got down to business. He took out a scroll, unrolled it in front of the hall, and projected the formula onto the wall. The hall fell silent. Dan heard someone in the upper rows suck in a breath through clenched teeth. The formula was legendary. Everyone knew it. A fragment of the structure of an ancient weapon, or a tool, or something that was both. Incomplete, dangerous. 3 dead bodies in 50 years. Vaughn said that Dan claims to be able to complete what has been lost. Well, here is what has been lost. Let him complete it. The room was silent. Dan walked up to the wall. He looked at the formula. His system flared up, brighter than ever. The formula was enormous, hundreds of symbols, dozens of layers, and among them, 5 empty spaces, 5 holes. 3 researchers filled the holes with the correct symbols. The formula closed and killed them.
Because the formula wasn't a problem, the formula was a lock. The correct key activated the defense, and the defense was deadly. A runic discharge capable of vaporizing a person. Dan saw him sleeping inside the structure, waiting, patient, like a landmine underfoot. He stood before the wall and said nothing. The hall waited. Vaughn smiled. 30 seconds. A minute. 2. Someone in the upper rows began to whisper. Maybe the vagabond wasn't as smart as he seemed. Maybe he realized he couldn't handle it. Maybe now he would turn around and leave in disgrace. Dan asked for chalk. The attendant handed it to him. Dan turned to face the audience, and instead of filling in the blanks in the formula, he began writing beside it. New text. Not a formula, an explanation. He wrote and spoke at the same time. He said he wouldn't solve this formula, not because he couldn't, but because solving it meant killing. He explained, slowly, clearly, so that everyone in the room would understand.
The formula is not a riddle. The formula is a weapon. The ancient creator intentionally left the blanks not because he forgot, but because he hid the key to the lock. And he built a trap for those who would try to pick it. The 3 researchers who died weren't fools. They were geniuses. They found the right runes, and that's exactly what killed them. The room was silent. Dan continued. He went through each of the 5 empty spaces. He showed which rune each of the dead would have inserted. He showed that every rune was correct. And he showed how the activation of the correct rune triggered the protective circuit. 1 death after another. 3 lives. 3 correct answers. 3 murders. Then he stopped. He looked at Vaughn and said quietly that the formula couldn't be solved correctly, but it could be solved differently. He turned toward the wall and wrote 5 runes in the 5 empty spaces. Incorrect ones. Asymmetrical. Crooked like patches on an old crystal in a village lantern. Runes that weren't in any textbook. Runes that didn't complete the formula but neutralized it. Like a sapper cutting wires. Not red, not blue, all at once. The protective contour flickered. The hall recoiled. Someone screamed. And the contour went out, quietly, gently, like a candle being blown out. The formula on the wall ceased to be a weapon. It became what it had been from the start, a drawing. Dan turned to the room. He said that now the formula could be studied safely, that the protection was gone, that the 3 researchers hadn't died in vain. Their data was correct. It was just that no one had warned them about the trap. He looked at Vaughn, not defiantly, questioningly. Why didn't you warn us? Vaughn sat motionless. His smile had vanished. His face had become a mask. His eyes were empty. Not angry, empty, like a lighthouse before it goes out. The hall was silent. Then someone stood up. An old professor in the back row. He began to clap, slowly, heavily, like the tolling a bell. Then a second, a third, a 10th. The hall stood. Not everyone, but most. They stood and clapped, not for Dan, for the 3 dead men, whose names he had just cleared, whose honor he had saved, posthumously. He stood up, he turned, and walked away. Silently, without a word, without a bow, he just walked away. Dan stood in the center of the hall and felt his knees tremble. Not from fear, from relief. He hadn't died, and no one had died. Today. Sora was waiting for him outside the hall. She stood leaning against the wall, her face expressionless. But her eyes. Dan saw her eyes. In them was what he had once seen in the village elder when the lantern flared. Something ancient, grateful, broken and put back together. She said it was Einar's formula, the one he had finished writing in her office. It was of the same type, the same principle. A bridge between systems. And if Sora had tried to complete it herself the standard way, she hadn't finished. She didn't have to. Dan didn't just solve the problem during the debate. He saved her life. A week earlier, in her office, when he wrote the 3 symbols on the board. If she had found the answer herself the standard way, the protective circuit would have killed her just like it did those 3. Sora Khan, the Academy's youngest professor, would have spent the rest of eternity as the 4th name on the list of the dead. She looked at Dan, he looked at her. And for the first time, there were no formulas between them. No runic circuits, no teacher and assistant. There were 2 people standing face to face, understanding. She turned first, quickly, abruptly, as if she'd been burned. And she walked down the hallway, at a brisk pace, without looking back. Dan watched her go and smiled. A small, weary smile of a man who was used to not being understood and had seen, for the first time, that he was understood. That evening in the workshop, they celebrated, if you could call it a celebration. Evelyn brought tea and pastries from the academic cafeteria. Minji programmed the golem to dance. The golem crashed into a bookshelf and knocked 3 books to the floor. Cassandra laughed. It was the first time Dan had heard her laugh. The sound was unexpected, light, as if inside the stone princess lived a girl who had never been allowed to laugh at court. Leah sat in the corner and smiled quietly. Tamar stood by the door, as always, but she held a flute in her hands, and sometimes she brought it to her lips, and played softly. 1 note, 2, 3, as if she were trying again. Dan sat among them and thought. He had won the debate. He had exposed the trap. He had saved the reputation of the dead and the living, but one had left. Not defeated, wounded. And a wounded beast is more dangerous than a healthy one. And somewhere beyond the academy walls, 3 extinguished beacons along the line leading to Wayland stood like dead columns. And whatever had extinguished them was 3 steps closer than yesterday. After the debate, the academy had changed. Dan was no longer a mystery. He had become a figure, a man to whom people came to, students, junior instructors, masters from the city. They brought broken formulas, artifacts that didn't work, questions no one could answer. Dan helped. But now it was different. He didn't fix things himself. He taught. He demonstrated. He explained. Look here. See this rune? It's not broken. It's out of place. Move it. No, not me. You. With your own hands. Because if I do it for you, you won't understand. But if you do it yourself, you'll know forever. He became a mentor. Not by title, in essence. His basement workshop had turned into an unofficial department. A place where those who felt constrained by the official curriculum came. Those who didn't think by the book. Those who asked uncomfortable questions. Sora watched. She didn't interfere. But Dan saw how she looked at his students, with something like jealousy. Not toward the people, toward the method. She had spent her life trying to be the best. He explained in a minute things she had taken years to grasp. And he did it easily, playfully, as if knowledge were water and he were simply turning on the tap. One evening she told him this. Straight out. No beating around the bush. She said she hated the ease with which he did what she had dedicated her life to. That every time he finished a formula in a second, she felt her years of work devalued. That she knew it was irrational. But that's exactly how she felt. Dan was silent. Then he said he understood. That he'd felt that way his whole life, too. Only the opposite. He'd seen people who knew one thing and did it brilliantly. Engineers who built, linguists who translated, historians who remembered. And he knew a little of everything and nothing properly. And every day he felt that his breadth was a weakness, that true talent was depth. He said that her years of work weren't worthless because he sees. But she does. He can read a formula in a second, but he can't execute it with his hands with the precision she does. His body is ordinary. His reserves are 0. Without her, his vision is useless. He an architect who can't lift a brick. She is a builder with a blueprint in her hands. They need each other. Sora was silent for a long time. Then she said that this was the most annoying and the most correct thing anyone had ever said to her. And she almost smiled. Meanwhile, Minji had made a breakthrough. The golem had learned to recognize runic patterns. Not to read them, not to understand them, but to see them, to distinguish. Minji programmed a visual analysis system into it, based on the principles Dan had been explaining to her for weeks. The golem could now look at an artifact and highlight problem areas. Not to fix them, show where it hurts. A diagnostician. Minji brought the golem to the workshop and demonstrated. The golem approached the broken heating element, stood there, raised a hand, and pointed to a crack in the third rune layer. Exactly. Correct. Minji beamed. Dan looked at her and saw the future. Not an abstract one, a concrete one. If Minji could teach a golem to see problems, then she could teach 10 golems, 100, 1,000, an army of diagnosticians, in every village, in every city. Dan wouldn't be needed to fix the eternal lantern. Minji's golem would be needed to show the local craftsman where the problem was, and the local craftsman would fix it himself. That was what he wanted. Not to be the only one. To give the world a tool so the world could fix itself. He told the team about it. That evening, all 6 of them were sitting in the workshop. Evelyn made tea. Dan laid out the plan. Not a plan to save a single Mayak, a plan to save them all. Minji's resonator could be copied, installed in every remaining Mayak, to slow down the parasites, to buy time. Diagnostic golems could be produced, distributed across the cities, to give people the opportunity to repair their artifacts without the Academy's help. The formulas they had recovered could be published. Don't hide them. Don't guard them jealously as the Academies have done for centuries. Distribute them, freely, to anyone who wants to learn. Sora objected. She said that the Academies exist because they control knowledge. If the formulas are distributed freely, the Academies will lose their power, and those at the head of the Academies will resist. It's war. Dan said he knew. Cassandra looked up from her calculations. She said the Crown would resist too. Because the Crown controls what the Academies control. The pyramid of power. Knowledge at the top, ignorance at the bottom. To break the pyramid is to break everything. Dan said he knew that too. Leah said quietly that God had divided himself precisely for this purpose, so that knowledge would cease to be the property of one, so that it would belong to everyone, and that Dan was doing what God had begun. Tamar said nothing. She took out her flute and played a single note, pure, clear, like an agreement that needs no words. Evelyn adjusted her glasses and said she would start copying the catalogs. All of them, completely. Every cross-reference, every bridge between disciplines. If knowledge is to become free, then the map of knowledge must be free first. Minji said she needed 3 months and access to the materials to build 10 golems. Dan said they didn't have 3 months. The lighthouse was fading. The resonator slowed the process but didn't stop it. The parasite was growing. And Juan was silent. And Juan's silence was more terrifying than his actions. Cassandra suggested something else. She said they needed to go to the nearest extinguished beacon, the one in the southwest, where the compass was pointing. If they understood how that one went out, they would understand how to save this one. Dan agreed, but leaving meant abandoning the Wayland beacon unattended. Someone had to stay. Sora said she would stay, with Evelyn and with Minji. They would monitor the resonator, continue the work, copy the formulas, build golems. Dan would go with Cassandra, her compass, her knowledge of the terrain, her political clout if they had to pass through foreign territories. Leah and Tamar would go with them. Leah because she knew the map of the places where there were traces of the forgotten god. Tamar because someone had to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Dan looked at Sora. She looked at him. Between them was something that needed no words. 2 people who understood each other before the sentence was even finished, and who now had to part ways. Sora told him to come back. In one word, come back. Dan nodded. In the morning, the 4 of them left Wayland. It was raining again, just like on the first day, just like always in this world when began. The journey to southwestern Mayak took 12 days. They rode on horseback. Cassandra had secured the horses through her connections. Dan was a poor rider. His body reminded him every day that understanding is no substitute for skill. He understood the biomechanics of riding perfectly. His hips were not agree with that. Tamar rode as if she had been born in the saddle. Leah rode calmly and smoothly. 22 years of walking pilgrimages had given her a stamina that Dan quietly envied. Cassandra rode ahead, compass in hand. The needle pointed straight ahead. They spoke little the first few days. Then they began to talk. At night by the campfire, Cassandra told her story. Not all of it. In bits and pieces, like a mosaic. She was the king's third daughter, not the heir, not a desirable bride. Third, the spare. Her sisters were beautiful and politically useful. Cassandra was sent away to study, not because they believed in her intellect, because they didn't know what to do with her. She studied out of spite. She became the best in her class, the best in her graduating class, the best of her generation. And yet she remained the third daughter, a tool of the crown. When the Miyaki began to fade, the crown sent her, not because they believed she could handle it, because if she couldn't, the loss would be small. The third daughter, disposable. Dan listened, and he saw. He saw a girl solving equations to prove she existed. He saw a woman hunting for the truth because the truth was the only thing the crown couldn't take from her. On the 6th day of their journey, they drove through a dead village. The houses were still standing. The roofs were intact. But there were no people. Not a single one. Doors open, belongings in place, food on the tables, covered in mold. As if the people had gotten up and left. All of them. At the same time. Leah said this was the devourer's mark. It wasn't people he ate. Knowledge, understanding, connections. The people in this village forgot everything in an instant. Who they were, where they were, why. They forgot how to speak, how to eat, how to breathe, and they left, into nowhere. Because nowhere and everywhere had become the same to them. Dan stood in the middle of the dead village and felt a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. This is what will happen to Wayland, to the academy, to Sora and Evelyn and Minji. If the lighthouse goes out, if the parasite devours the crystal, if the devourer comes. They quickened their pace. On the 12th day they saw the lighthouse, or rather, what was left of it. A huge crystal the size of a house, like the one in Wayland, only dead. Black. Not dim. Black. As if the light hadn't just left it, but had been drained to the last drop. The crystal hung in the air, still. The runic structure holding it in levitation didn't depend on the lighthouse's energy. It was part of the stone on which it stood, a separate system. But everything else was dead. The town around the lighthouse was dead too. Not like a village, different. Here people hadn't left, here people had stayed. But they had ceased to be human in the full sense. They wandered the streets, with empty eyes, doing something with their hands, but without meaning. A woman was sweeping a clean floor. A man was hammering a stone. Not a nail, a stone. Over and over. A child sat on the threshold and stared at the wall. They had forgotten. Not everything, partially. They had forgotten why. They remembered how. The body remembered the movements. The mind had forgotten the purpose. Leah was crying, quietly, turning away. Tamar stood nearby and held her by the shoulder. Her face was stony, but the hand on Leah's shoulder was trembling. Cassandra wasn't crying. She was counting, writing down, recording. How many people, which functions remained, which were lost. Her scientific mind kept working because if it stopped, she would break. Dan approached the lighthouse. He placed his hand on the base and closed his eyes. The system flashed. It hurt, like a burn. He saw. The crystal wasn't empty. It was hollow, like a nut with its kernel scooped out. The shell was intact, the structure was in place, but inside, nothing. The knowledge that had been stored inside it for 1,000 years had been devoured, completely. And on the inner walls of the crystal, Dan saw marks, like scratches from claws, runic imprints, the devourer's signature. He studied them for an hour, 2, 3. Cassandra stood nearby and wrote down everything he said aloud, every detail, every observation. By evening, Dan understood. The devourer didn't just consume knowledge, he digested it. He turned structure into chaos, understanding into noise. But the process wasn't instantaneous. Between consumption and digestion, there was a pause, a window, a brief one, maybe minutes, maybe seconds, but a window. If at that moment you could pull the knowledge back out of the devourer, then it could be returned to the crystal, theoretically. In practice, this meant that someone had to climb inside the parasite, into the runic structure, into the very heart of that which devours knowledge, and pull it back out. Someone who understands, someone who sees the structure, someone capable of finding their way in another's chaos. Him. Only him. Dan sat at the foot of the dead beacon and stared at the black crystal. He couldn't save this beacon. It was empty. There was nothing to pull out here. But he could save the next one, if he made it in time. If the parasite in the Wayland beacon hadn't finished devouring the crystal yet, if he returned in time. That night, Dan didn't sleep.
He sat by the fire and stared into the flames. And the voice returned, quiet, distant, fainter than the first time in the ruins. The voice said it was proud, that it hadn't been wrong in its choice, and that soon Dan would have to decide. Dan asked what he had to decide. The voice said he had to decide who he was. Vessel or contents, heir or God, man or knowledge. Because when he entered the parasite to rip the knowledge back out, the parasite would see him. See what was inside. See the God hidden in the body of a vagabond. And the devourer will come. Not a tentacle, not a parasite. Himself, in his entirety. And then Dan will either pull himself back together into a God and have the strength to fight, or he'll remain human and have only what he has. Hands, a voice, and the people around him. The voice fell silent. Dan sat and stared into the fire, and thought about the tea he didn't know how to brew. About Sora, who almost smiled.
About Minji, who beamed when the golem picked up the key. About Tamar, who cried while playing the flute. About Leah, who heard the answer. About Evelyn, who felt needed for the first time. About Cassandra, who laughed like a little girl. He knew the answer. He had known it from the very first day. They raced back. Dan cut the 12-day journey down to 8. Cassandra knew the short paths through the mountain passes. Tamar led the group at night while the others slept in their saddles. Leah read the road by the stars, an ancient skill of the order. The stars in Aldorain were different, but the principle was the same. The light above shows the way below. On the 3rd day of the return journey, Dan received a message. A bird, a small one, with a runic outline on its foot. A message from Evelyn, a short one. The beacon flashed again, twice in one night. The resonator overheated. Minji is fixing it. Sora hasn't slept in 3 days.
Vaughn is holding closed-door meetings with the dean's office. Something is brewing. Hurry. Dan spurred his horse. His thighs were burning. His back ached. His body was that of a vagabond, not a warrior or a horseman. But he rode on. Because the people he had left behind in Wayland were waiting. On the 5th day, they encountered travelers. A dozen people on the road, with empty eyes, wandering eastward, without belongings, without a destination, with faces on which there was nothing. No fear, no pain, no thought. Emptiness. Victims of another extinguished beacon. The eastern one, which had gone out while they were on the road. Leah stopped. She wanted to help. Tamar touched her shoulder and shook her head. They couldn't help these people now. There was only one way to help. Save the Wayland Lighthouse. Stop the chain reaction. Bring knowledge back to the world. They drove on. On the 8th day, they saw Wayland and the lighthouse. It was burning, but so faintly that Dan didn't immediately distinguish it from a star. A dim glow above the spires. A last breath. They entered the city at night. The streets were empty. Curfew. The guards let them through on Cassandra's seal. The princess carried weight even in the middle of the night. They were waiting for them in the workshop. All 3 of them. Sora with dark circles under her eyes. Evelyn with a worn notebook full of numbers. Minji with her hands covered in machine oil and burn marks on her fingers. The resonator was working, but at its limit. Minji had reconfigured it 3 times that week. Each time the parasite adapted. It was eating faster, growing faster, as if it sensed time was running out. Sora said one hadn't been sitting idly by. He'd pushed through the dean's office a decision to evacuate valuable archives, formally for security. In reality, he was taking knowledge out of the academy, under his control. No one knew exactly where.
But Evelyn noticed things missing from the library. Books were disappearing. Scrolls, the most valuable ones, the most ancient ones, quietly, at night. One was preparing for the beacon to go out, and he was preparing to become the only one who would preserve what remained. Control through scarcity. If knowledge vanished from everywhere except his vaults, then he would become the new beacon. Alive. The only one. Omnipotent. Dan gathered everyone. 7 people in the basement workshop. Night. Light from rune candles. He laid out the plan. Simple. Insane. The only one. He would enter the beacon. Not physically, through runic contact. His system allowed him to see the structure from the inside. He had already done this when he touched the dead crystal in the southwest. But here the crystal was still alive, and the parasite inside was active. Dan would enter the structure, find the parasite, and the moment the parasite is digesting its next portion of knowledge, Dan will rip the knowledge back out, pour it into the crystal. It's like open heart surgery. One wrong move and the lighthouse will explode. Or Dan will burn up. Or both. But he couldn't do it alone. He could go inside. He could see. He could figure out what to do. But his body, his ordinary, frail human body wouldn't withstand the strain. He needed hands. 6 pairs of hands, each with its own task. He assigned the roles. Sora got the stabilization rune. She had to keep the Mayax rune network in balance while Dan worked inside. Like a surgical nurse who holds the wound open while the surgeon operates. Only Sora could do it. Her precision was absolute. Evelyn's word. The ancient key word from the scroll that Leah had brought. The word that unlocked access to the beacon's core. Evelyn wasn't a mage, but she was a keeper, a librarian. She had kept words her whole life. And she would pronounce this word exactly right, at the right moment, with the right intonation, because words were her gift. Minji's spark, energy. The Minji golem carried a resonator within it, a small one, a personal one. Minji had to channel energy into the crystal at the very moment Dan wrested the knowledge from the parasite, like a blood transfusion. A second's delay and the knowledge would dissipate. Leah's note, not a rune, not a formula, a note, a sound, a vibration. The Order of the Forgotten God kept hymns that resonated with the particles of the god in the lighthouses. Leah would sing, and her voice would become a bridge between Dan inside the crystal and the world outside. His anchor, his way home, to Mars' protection. Because when Dan entered the lighthouse, he would become visible. Bright, blinding. Every devourer in the world would sense him, and someone would come. Maybe not the devourer himself, maybe his servants, maybe Vorn. Tamar will stand between them and the lighthouse, and she won't let anyone through. Cassandra's guidance. Her compass was tuned to the source of knowledge. When Dan is inside the lighthouse, the compass will show exactly where he is. Cassandra will be his navigator. She would tell him where to move amid the chaos of the runic structure. A voice from outside guiding him through the darkness. 6 roles, 6 women, 1 conductor. Sora asked when. Dan said now. Not tomorrow, not in an hour, now. Because the lighthouse was dying right now, and to wait meant to lose. They climbed the tower. Night. Wind. The lighthouse above them, dim as a dying candle. Dan stood at the base of the crystal. He placed both hands on the stone. He closed his eyes, and he entered. The world vanished. Sound vanished. The wind vanished. He stood inside the crystal, inside the runic structure. Thousands of layers, millions of connections, and among them, darkness, alive, pulsating, hungry. The parasite was enormous, much larger than Dan had imagined from the outside. It entwined the core of the lighthouse like ivy entwines a tree. Black tentacles made of anti-runes, symbols in reverse.
signs that did not signify but destroyed meaning. Dan saw the parasite eating, slowly, methodically, tearing a piece of knowledge from the core, enveloping it, squeezing it. And the knowledge ceased to be knowledge. It became noise, emptiness, nothing. And between the tearing away and the emptiness there was a pause, a second, maybe two, a window. Dan moved, not with his body, with his understanding. He reached for the nearest tentacle and saw a piece of knowledge inside, a formula, ancient, beautiful. A formula for controlling water, one that allowed aqueducts to be built without pumps, one that provided clean water to villages and cities. He tore it out, not with his hands, with his vision. He saw the form of the knowledge and saw the form of the hole from which it had been torn and put it back, like a piece of a mosaic. Somewhere far away, Sora was holding on. The stabilization rune burned on her hands. Sweat trickled down her temples, her teeth were clenched, but she held on. Evelyn spoke the word. Quietly, clearly, like a librarian pronouncing the title of a book. With respect, with precision, with love for every syllable. Minji activated the golem. A spark flowed into the crystal. Energy, life, food for the hungry beacon. Leah sang, quietly, deeply, an ancient hymn in a language known to no one but her and Dan. Her voice was a thread, a rope, a path. Dan heard it within the chaos, amid the darkness, and he knew where to go. Cassandra held the compass. The needle spun wildly. Then it stopped. It pointed. Cassandra shouted to him where? To the left. Deeper. Right there. Another fragment. Tamar stood at the entrance to the tower, sword drawn. And they came.
3 of them, in gray robes. Vana's men. Tamar didn't speak, didn't warn them. She stepped forward. The first fell 2 seconds later. The second 4 seconds later. The third turned and ran. Tamar didn't pursue him. She returned to her position, sword in hand, eyes on the stairs. No one else came up. Inside the lighthouse, Dan was working, fragment by fragment, knowledge by knowledge. He was tearing it out and returning it. The parasite twitched, resisted, hissed anti-runes, but Dan saw it, saw the structure, saw the weaknesses. He saw that the parasite was not a separate being. It was a tentacle, an extension of something greater, something that sat in the darkness between the lighthouses and pulled the strings. The devourer. It was far away, but he sensed it. Dan felt it like a gaze, enormous, hungry, ancient. The gaze of a creature that devoured gods, and that had just seen a god, inside a vagabond, inside a vessel. A voice screamed in his head. For the first time ever, the voice was screaming. It was screaming that he needed to pull himself together, to become whole, to become a god. That was the only way to survive. That was the only way to fight. Dan felt the knowledge inside him respond, how the fragments of a god wanted to come together, how easy it would be to become whole, omnipotent, all-knowing, the god of knowledge. And to lose himself, to lose Dan Carver, to lose the 3 universities he'd dropped out of, and his inability to brew tea, and Evelyn's warm smile, and Sora's almost smile. He made a choice. He remained himself. And instead of becoming a god, he did what he'd always done. He gave. He gave a fragment of understanding to Sora, through the rune bond, not knowledge, understanding. How to hold, how to be precise, how to be even more precise than she already was. And Sora blazed. The rune of stabilization on her hands turned golden. He gave a fragment to Evelyn, an understanding of words, profound. How words are connected to the world. And Evelyn spoke the second word, a word that wasn't in the scroll, one she created herself. Now, in this very second, because she understood how. He gave the fragment to Minji, understanding of structures, and Minji's golem flashed with golden light and poured energy into the lighthouse that it shouldn't have possessed. Because Minji understood how to remove the restrictions. He gave a fragment to Leah, and Leah sang so that the walls of the tower trembled, not with the voice of a priestess, with the voice of the one she had been searching for her whole life. God spoke with her voice, and the bridge between the worlds became as wide as a river. He gave a fragment to Cassandra, an understanding of direction. And Cassandra saw, not with a compass, with her eyes, the entire lighthouse, every fragment, every scrap of stolen knowledge. She shouted the coordinates to him faster than he could move. He gave a fragment to Tamar, and Tamar raised her flute. She sheathed her sword and began to play, a melody that made the gray robes on the stairs fall to their knees and cover their ears, a melody that was a shield, a wall, a fortress, the music of a warrior who remembered that he could do more than just kill. The lighthouse flared, not by 4%, by 100, by 200, by 1,000. Golden light struck the sky. All of Wayland awoke. People ran out into the streets and looked up. The lighthouse burned as brightly as it hadn't since before the silence. The parasite inside the crystal writhed, shrinking, burning in the golden light. It was a rune construct, and Dan understood rune constructs better than anyone in the world. He saw every anti-rune, and for every anti-rune, he knew the rune that extinguishes it, not erases, extinguishes, turns darkness back into light. The parasite died, quietly, like a candle that's been blown out. Only the other way around, a candle that had been lit. Dan surfaced.
He opened his eyes. He fell to his knees. His nose was bleeding. His hands were shaking. His body was the body of an ordinary man, and it had paid the price. But he was alive, and the lighthouse was burning, and 6 women stood around him. Each one glowed. Not with magic, with understanding. He gave them a piece, and they didn't break. They blossomed. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the horizon, the devourer pulled back a tentacle, like a hand scorched by fire. He saw a god, and saw that the god was not alone, that the god had divided himself, again. Not into crystals, into people, into living, breathing, laughing, crying people. And that was what the devourer could not eat. Because knowledge in a crystal can be stolen, but knowledge in the heart of a person who loves and is loved can only be killed along with the heart. And there were 7 hearts. The morning after Mayek's rescue was quiet. Dan lay in his basement room and couldn't move. His body was giving out. Every muscle was burning, every joint creaked. The price for an ordinary man letting the power of a god pass through him. Evelyn sat nearby, with tea. She didn't ask how he was feeling, she could see. She just sat there and brewed tea. And for the first time, Dan tasted it, and the tea was just right. Golden, warm, without bitterness. He looked at the cup, looked at Evelyn. She smiled. Said that yesterday he had given her a piece of understanding, and she finally understood what he was doing wrong with the tea. He brews it like a formula. But tea isn't a formula. Tea is a conversation. Dan laughed. For the first time in a long time, he truly laughed, and immediately winced because his ribs hurt. He spent the next 3 days in bed. The team worked without him, and they worked brilliantly. The fragments of understanding he had shared didn't disappear. They remained. They took root. They became part of each of the 6. Sora worked with formulas at a level she had never reached before.
Not because she had received someone else's knowledge, because she had gained an understanding of how to connect her own knowledge with that of others. A bridge, one she had been building her whole life, one that had finally appeared. In 3 days, Minji built 2 new diagnostic golems, not copies of the old ones, improved versions. Her ideas, which had previously outpaced her hands, were now being realized with precision. Her hands had caught up with her mind. Evelyn cataloged everything Dan had extracted from the lighthouse. Recovered knowledge, formulas, languages, blueprints, thousands of fragments. She organized them into a system that was a work of art. Every fragment in its place, every connection visible. A map of the world's knowledge, complete, living, open. Cassandra wrote a report for the Crown, but not the one they expected from her. Not a report on control over the lighthouse. A report on the necessity of opening knowledge to all.
With mathematical models showing that closed knowledge is vulnerable, while distributed knowledge is invulnerable. That the devourer can eat a crystal but cannot eat 1,000,000 people at once. That the world's only defense is not a wall around knowledge, but knowledge in every home. The Crown will receive the report. The Crown will consider it. The third daughter wrote a document that will change the course of generations. not as a princess, as a scientist. Leah prayed, but differently. Before, she had prayed into the silence. Now she knew that God was listening, not from somewhere above, from within, from that sliver of understanding Dan had given her. God was not a being in the heavens. God was the ability to understand, and that ability now lived within her. She established a new canon for the order, not service to a distant God, service to understanding, in every person. Tamar played, every evening, on a repaired flute with a crack that had become part of the sound.
Students came to listen. Then they asked to be taught. Tamar, the warrior priestess with a sword and scars, became a music teacher in the basement of the academy. She did not cease to be a warrior, but she ceased to be only a warrior. On the fourth day, Dan got up. He went out to the workshop and saw that the world had changed. Not all of it, not yet. But here, in the basement of the Wayland Academy, the world was already different. 7 people, 7 sets of skills, 1 shared understanding, not his, theirs, a common one, alive, growing. He had given them seeds. They grew trees. 1 remained, Alistair Vaughn. He hadn't shown up for 3 days. His office was empty. His things were still there, but he had vanished. Evelyn found him in the archives, in that very locked vault from which he had been taking books. He was sitting on the floor, among the scrolls, old, tired, no mask, no silver smile, just an old man among books. Dan came alone, sat across from him, and watched. His system worked silently, without flashes. It was dissecting Vaughn, layer by layer. And what Dan saw was not what he expected. Vaughn was not a villain. Vaughn was a scientist, a genius, who 50 years ago found the first parasite, realized that the Mayaki were dying, realized that the world's knowledge was disappearing. And he was afraid. Not for himself, for knowledge. He decided that the only way to save knowledge was to hide it, to concentrate it, to control it. If the world couldn't protect knowledge, then he, Alistair Vaughn, would, alone. He made a deal, not with the devourer, with its shadow, with that part of the darkness that offered immortality in exchange for control. Vaughn gained a long life. The darkness gained access. One thought he was controlling the process, that he was feeding the parasite crumbs while saving the essentials, that he was sacrificing the small for the greater good. He was wrong. For 50 years he fed the parasite. For 50 years the parasite grew. And Juan saw it, and couldn't stop it, because the deal was irreversible, because immortality cannot be returned, because he was too afraid to die before finishing. Dan sat across from him and saw it all. Fear, guilt, pride, and beneath it all, pain. The pain of a man who wanted to save the world and instead helped destroy it, who woke up every day knowing he was the reason the Mayaki were fading. And every day he kept going because to stop meant to admit it. Dan said quietly that he understood. Vaughn lifted his head. His eyes were red. He said it was impossible, that no one could understand 50 years of guilt. Dan said he could, because that was his gift, to understand, not to judge, to understand. Vaughn was silent for a long time. Then he pulled a crystal from his bosom, small, black, pulsating, a link to the darkness, his anchor, his chain, his immortality. He placed the crystal on the floor between them. Dan looked at the crystal. He saw its structure. He saw how the darkness flowed through it into Juan, and from Juan into the world. A channel. It can be closed, cut off, but Vaughn will die. 50 years of borrowed life will end in an instant. Dan said this. Vaughn nodded. He knew. He had always known. Dan asked if he was sure. Vaughn said he was tired, that 50 years was long enough to get tired, and that if a vagrant from the basement could do what he hadn't been able to do in half a century, then maybe the world could manage without Alistair Vaughn. Dan took the crystal. 1 rune, One small, crooked, imperfect rune scratched with a fingernail onto the black surface. The cracked. A light flashed, and Vaughn exhaled, calmly, quietly, like a man who had finally laid down a burden he had carried for too long. He didn't die instantly. 50 years didn't collapse all at once. They flowed away, quickly, but not instantly. He had time. He looked at Dan. His face was already changing, aging, like a photograph developing in real time.
He said there was a chest in the third vault on the left. In the chest was everything he had collected, all the books, all the scrolls, everything he had taken from the library over 30 years. He wanted to hide, now let Dan distribute it. He said one more thing. He said the devourer would not back down, that the severed tentacle would return, and that the next strike would not be against the lighthouse, against people, against those who carry knowledge within themselves, against 6 women, against Dan, against everyone he had taught, because the devourer is learning, and he has just learned that knowledge can live within people. Juan closed his eyes, his breathing slowed. He looked like a very old, very tired man who had finally been allowed to sleep. Dan sat beside him and didn't leave. He sat there until Juan stopped breathing. Then he closed his eyes. He stood up and walked out. They were waiting for him in the workshop, all 6 of them. He told them about Juan, about the chest, about the warning, about the devourer returning. Silence. Then Sora stood up and said they needed to get to work, that the lighthouse had been saved, but the other 4 were still burning, and that if they could save one, they could save them all. Minji said the golems would be ready in a month, 10 of them, for 10 cities, the beginning of the network. Evelyn said the catalog was ready to be copied, 100 copies, for 100 libraries, a map of knowledge for anyone who wants to learn. Cassandra said the report had been sent. The Crown would consider it. But the Crown thinks slowly. They wouldn't wait. Leah said the order was restructuring. A new canon. Not service to a distant god, service to understanding. The priestesses will become teachers. The temples will become schools. Tamar said nothing. She picked up the flute and played a melody. Short, clear, like a promise. Dan stood among them. 7 people in the academy's basement. Not an army, not an order, not a kingdom. A family, a strange one, an impossible one, assembled from loners who found each other in a world that had fallen apart. And he understood, not through the system, through himself. That very Dan Carver who had dropped out of 3 universities and fallen asleep on a night bus and woken up in the rain in a foreign world. He understood that the devourer would return, that it would be harder, that the world is vast and sick, that the 4 lighthouses still burn and God knows how many villages have already forgotten how to speak. But he also understood that he was not alone, and that this was the only knowledge that could not be devoured. He remembered the voice from the book, tired, warm, human. The voice that had told him on the first night that it had been waiting for just such a fool. And he finally understood that the voice wasn't speaking to him. The voice was speaking to itself. The God who had hidden himself in the body of an eternal underachiever was addressing his own forgotten memory. It said that it was not all in vain, that the loneliness would end, that someday this fool standing in the rain among the ruins would find people, and they would light a flame, not in crystal, within themselves. Dan looked at the 6 faces around him. Each was a separate world. Each carried within itself a fragment of understanding that he had given, and that they had nurtured into something greater than he could have imagined. He was a god who had decided to remain human, and it was the best decision of his life. He said quietly that they had a lot of work to do. Sora nodded. Evelyn smiled. Minji patted the golem on the shoulder. Cassandra opened her notebook. Leah folded her hands in prayer. Tamar began to play. And somewhere above them, the Wayland lighthouse shone brighter than ever. A golden light in the night. Not the last, the first.